The weapon may be formed, but it won't prosper. And when the darkness falls, it won't prevail. 'Cause the God I serve knows only how to triumph. And my God will never fail. No, my God will never fail. And I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. There's power in the mighty name of Jesus. In every war he wages, he will win. And I'm not backing down from any giant, 'cause I know how this story ends. Yes, I know how this story ends. And I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good. You turn it for good. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good. You turn it for good. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good. You turn it for good. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good. You turn it for good. And I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good. You turn it for good. Yes, you do. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turn it for good. You turn it for good. Oh, I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord.
Hey friends, this is Dustin. I want to welcome you to this week's message. Now I know that at this point during the pandemic, it's been so long since Many of us have traveled that we can't recall the last time that we were able to board a plane and fly somewhere. But for the sake of this week's message, I want us to recall and recollect instances where we have flown in the past. I know there have been plenty of times where I've been on a plane and the plane starts to get jostled by a little bit of turbulence, and most of the time you don't think anything of it. But I remember one instance where the plane was getting beat left and right, up and down, and a man that was in front of me flying, it was one of his first times flying, he started to panic. You could tell that he was starting to hyperventilate. He was clutching down on the armrest with white knuckle grips, and a woman next to him put her arm on his shoulder and she said, "Don't worry, just look at the flight attendants. Because if they're not concerned, then you have nothing to be concerned about." Now, if the flight attendants start to look scared, then you have something to worry about. Well, many of us, we find ourselves in a situation like that now. We are in the midst of this coronavirus, this pandemic, and life feels turbulent. We're being beat left and right, and it doesn't seem like this sort of commotion is ever going to stop anytime soon. Many of us have started to look to the proverbial flight attendants in our lives, hoping to see the reaction of the authority figures. We look to the news, we look to the social media where we're looking at articles, we're talking to friends, we're trying to find someone that we can see as a credible figure of being in control to see if they are panicked or not. Well, we actually see an instance occur in the scriptures that are so similar to this. In Mark's Gospel, chapter 4, starting in verse 35, we read these words. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Now, before we jump to the ramifications of these verses for our life navigating this storm that we find ourselves in, it's helpful to remind ourselves of the context that this passage occurred within. Now, remember, in this instance, Jesus has recruited the disciples. He's invited them to follow him and journey with him in life. They've been seeing him make proclamations and demonstrations of the power and goodness of God's kingdom. They've been seeing him do his thing left and right. They would have had instance after instance to determine and develop a credibility of faith in him leading up to this point before they push off to go to sea to eventually encounter the storm. Speaking of storms, there's another thing that we need to understand at this point. See, in ancient Israel, within the Jewish people, there was an assumption that the sea represented a void. It would represent chaos. It was a vessel of evil in some instances. And so that's why we see over and over again from the creation account of God sending his breath over the waters to bring order, of God setting his spirit over the waters in the flood to bring restoration, of God through the Psalms calming the storm by his word, by his breath. We see this occurring over and over again to demonstrate and communicate to us that no matter what the storm is, no matter how chaotic life seems, no matter how much of a void of goodness there is, no matter how evil something appears to be, God is bigger. God is bigger. But in the case of this instance here, even though there was this general assumption that the sea was something to be avoided, remember that a number of the disciples that we find in the boat with Jesus at this point were themselves fishermen. They are the exception to the general norm within the culture that we find this passage occurring in. These men lived on this body of water. They made their livelihood spending day in and day out sailing on these waters, and they undoubtedly encountered the squalls that would frequently kick up on the Sea of Galilee. And I would imagine that 9 times out of 10, they wouldn't bat an eye at those. They were the proverbial flight attendants that said, oh, it's just a bit of turbulence. We've seen this before. It's nothing. So for the fact that this instance shows us something different means that there's a severity to this storm that we ought to pay attention to. These grizzled sailors that had seen squall after squall in their life now were quaking in their proverbial boots, looking to Jesus. And they looked at Jesus and they asked him a question that I'm sure many of us have asked Jesus in this time. Don't you care? They asked him, don't you care that we're about to drown? Many of us might be asking Jesus, don't you care that I might be getting sick? Don't you care that my loved ones are getting, don't you care that people in your world are, don't you care that I've lost my income? Don't you care that I'm quarantined? Don't you care? And Jesus stands up in this moment and he lets his actions answer for him. He stands up, he says, quiet, be still. Now, thinking about this, obviously Jesus is saying it to the waves and the wind, but we could imagine him saying it to our own hearts too. I imagine that there is probably a dual meaning here, that the disciples probably stood some benefit to hear Jesus say to their hearts, to their racing minds, quiet, be still. Now, in and of itself, hearing Jesus say both to the storm and to our hearts, quiet, be still, is valuable. But it's the second group of words that I want us to focus on. Jesus then turns to the disciples and he asks this question. He says, why are you so afraid? Where's your faith? Essentially, he follows up with. Now, it'd be too easy just to assume that Jesus is rhetorically asking that, assuming that the answer is already there. But I want us to picture Jesus asking me now the actual reason why I am afraid. Ask yourself, why is it that I am afraid in this moment? What is causing my fear to well up within me? What is causing my fear to well up within me and then displace my faith? See, so often that's why we see the people of God in scriptures commanded not to fear, because somehow it's like oil and water that as one fills up, it displaces the other. We are a vessel, and as fear wells within us, it will push out the faith that we have. But the more that we have our faith increase, the smaller capacity that we have to experience fear. So Jesus asks them, why are you afraid? And in my own life, I have to ask, why is it that I'm afraid in this situation? Am I afraid because I crave normalcy above all else? Am I afraid because I don't like the experience of being sick? Am I afraid because I have to face my own mortality? Am I afraid because I think this is the answer for a lot of us when we get down to the bottom of it? I don't know that I really trust that Jesus will take care of me. I imagine that that is undoubtedly the reason that drove those disciples to have fear in that instance. That the storm was something that was out of their control. They wouldn't be able to handle it. And so they go to Jesus and they ask him, don't you care that we're about to drown? They're afraid that Jesus isn't going to take care of them. But Jesus demonstrates that nothing could be further from the truth. Jesus demonstrates to you and I with each time that we inhale and exhale, with each opportunity we have to experience life, with each opportunity that we've experienced in the past and have a promise to experience in the future, that he will take care of us. But here is the kicker. Our focus needs to shift. See, here's the thing. For the disciples, they were more concerned with getting out of the storm than anything else. Their primary concern was getting out of that particular circumstance, to escape the waves. But what we learn in this instance is this. It is not about getting me out of the storm. It is about having Jesus in the boat. Friends, I've said time and time again that this storm will pass. This coronavirus is not going to be eternal. God is eternal. No matter how severe or strong the storm might seem in our lives, it pales in comparison to the mighty arm, strength, power, glory of our God. It's not even a comparison. And yet, many of us have our prayer focus and our heart set on getting out of the storm, when really the reality is we should be focusing on getting Jesus into our boat. So wherever you are today, whatever is actually causing you to be afraid, whatever is starting to put stress on your faith, no matter what particular aspect of this storm has you concerned, I want to ask that we as the people of God would start to shift our prayers from being solely get me out of the storm to Jesus, would you come into this boat? Jesus, this boat that we find ourselves in, would you find a home in this boat? May we make home for Jesus in our proverbial boats, so much so that he would find the hospitality there, that he could curl up and take a nap. So thank you so much for joining us this week. May we be a people that have a faith that displaces fear. May we not be a people that pander to it and point to it, but live lives that care for our neighbors. And may we be a people whose prayers are focused not on just escaping the storm, though we all would prefer to do that, but let our chief objective being having Jesus reside in the boat with us. So friends, thank you so much. We'll see you soon.